On Tuesday, April 4, 1922, mechanic Albert Hofner arrived at a lonely Bavarian farm to repair a small diesel engine. For more than 4 hours, he worked while 6 murdered people lay only yards away. He whistled and sang to make his presence known. He ran the engine when the work was finished. No one came out, but in Hofner's later account, the farm did not seem quite the same when he left as it had when he arrived. A barn door that had been closed appeared open. The dog, first heard inside, was later tied outside. If Hofner remembered those details correctly, then someone may have been moving around Hinterkaifeck while he worked. After the killings, Hinterkaifeck did not fall completely still. The violence itself had a clear outline. 6 people killed during one evening, 4 in the barn and 2 inside the house. What followed was harder to explain. The cattle were not simply abandoned. Food appears to have been used, smoke was reportedly seen, and a fire may have been lit in the bake oven. For nearly 4 days, while neighbors wondered why the family had vanished, the farm continued to give off faint signs of life. The evidence pulled in 2 directions from the start. One path led to a stranger who entered the farm, hid above the family, and remained after the attack. The other led toward someone local, familiar enough with the house to come and go without attracting attention. The footprints, missing key, dog, and attic evidence shift the balance from one possibility to the other. None settles it. Hinterkaifeck was not the official name of the property. On records, it was Grobern 27½, a farm standing outside the small village of Grobern, near Reuthaue and roughly 6 kilometers from Schrobenhausen. The nickname meant something close to behind Kaifeck, describing its isolated position beyond another settlement. It was remote, but not invisible. The edge of Grobern was a few hundred meters away. From parts of the farm, a person could see toward neighboring land. Sounds could carry in some directions and vanish in others. The buildings were joined in an L-shaped arrangement. The living quarters, stable, and barn formed one connected structure, with a loft extending above much of it. From the upper level, a person could move between sections without stepping into the open courtyard. Someone familiar with the layout could also pass from the barn, through the stable, and into the house. The farm was secluded enough to conceal violence. It was still close enough that an offender had to consider neighbors, visitors, church, school, deliveries, and animals that would soon begin making noise. 6 people lived or arrived there on March 31, 1922. The head of the household was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber. His wife, Cäzilia, was 72. Their widowed daughter, 35-year-old Viktoria Gabriel, lived with them along with her children, 7-year-old Cäzilia, usually called Cilli, and 2-year-old Josef. The 6th victim, Maria Baumgartner, was a 45-year-old maid who had never slept a night at Hinterkaifeck. Her sister brought her to the farm at about 4:30 that afternoon, helped carry her belongings inside, and left roughly an hour later. Maria had taken a difficult position. The previous maid, Crescens Rieger, had left months earlier. She later described the farm as unsettling and said she had heard unexplained sounds. Some retellings make those claims sound like a direct warning that a stranger was living in the attic. The surviving record is less clean. Parts of the story were written down years later, after the murders had already turned every creak and missing object into evidence. Still, Maria arrived at a household that had recently experienced several events Andreas Gruber found troubling. Around March 30, Andreas reportedly noticed that a lock on the engine shed had been broken. There appeared to have been an attempt to enter the adjoining feed room. He also told neighbors that he had found footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the woods toward the farm. He could not find a second trail leading away. There was no photograph of those prints, no cast, and no police examination before the killings. The clue survives only through people who heard Andreas describe it. It remains a genuine pre-crime report, but not a measured trail. A newspaper from Munich had appeared on the property even though no one nearby was known to subscribe to it. A house key was missing. Andreas was said to have heard footsteps or noises above the living area. In one version, he searched the building and found nothing. In another, he was reluctant to involve the police despite being advised to do so. The details vary, but the pattern is consistent enough to matter. Before March 31, Andreas believed somebody might have entered the farm or approached it without permission. From those details came the theory that has never left the case. An intruder followed the tracks to Hinterkaifeck, hid in the loft, watched the family through a displaced roof tile, and waited. It may even be true. The original evidence does not support that scene with certainty. No witness saw anyone enter the attic, and no object found there could be tied to a specific stranger. Later findings in the loft seem to give the theory shape. Even so, the theory begins with real observations and ends in a room the investigation could never fully illuminate. The last confirmed hours of March 31 were ordinary enough to be almost cruel. Maria Baumgartner arrived and began settling in. The family completed its work, and Cilli returned from school. Sometime that evening, probably between about 7:30 and 9, the household was attacked. There was no emergency call, no surviving witness, and no reliable account of the order in which the victims died. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence from where the bodies were found. 4 members of the family, Andreas, his wife Cäzilia, Viktoria, and young Cilli, were discovered close together in the barn, near the passage connecting it with the stable. The usual interpretation is that they entered that area one at a time and were struck in rapid succession. An animal may have drawn the first person in. Someone may then have called the others. Recognition could also explain why no immediate alarm was raised. Every version requires an assumption because the barn preserved positions, not conversation. The weapon was most likely a Reuthaue, a heavy farm tool similar to a mattock or Reuthaue. The blows were concentrated mainly on the victims' heads, often on the right side. The surviving medical transcriptions indicate that surprise was a major part of the attack. No clear defensive injuries were recorded. One of the adult women also had signs of strangulation, although the surviving documents do not establish with confidence which woman it was. Whatever the exact order, the attacker controlled the encounters and prevented an effective struggle. 7-year-old Cilli appears to have survived the initial blows for some time, possibly hours. Investigators found that she had pulled or clutched at her own hair. Her survival stretches the timeline beyond the first attack, though the precise interval remains uncertain. If she remained alive while the offender moved through the house, someone had time to cover the bodies, cross into the residence, and continue. Maria Baumgartner was killed in the small room assigned to the maid. She was found on the floor, partly beneath the bed, still wearing outdoor clothing and shoes. Her borrowed backpack had not been fully unpacked. A feather bed had been placed over her. 2-year-old Josef was killed in the room he shared with Viktoria, while lying in his pram or crib. A red garment had been used to cover him. The coverings had been placed after the attacks. They show deliberate movement, but they cannot reveal whether the purpose was concealment, habit, remorse, or simply the offender's refusal to look at what had been done. No one came to the farm on April 1, expecting to find a crime scene. Coffee sellers called and received no answer. Cilli did not appear at school. The family missed church on Sunday, April 2, an absence that would have been noticed in a small Catholic community. On April 3, the postman left a newspaper at the kitchen window. He later recalled that a pram usually kept in the kitchen was not in its normal place. Each absence widened the gap between the farm's routine and the silence around it, but none yet forced an entry. There were also signs that someone had not simply fled the moment the last victim was attacked. A neighbor named Michael Pluckel later said that, while passing the property late on April 1, he saw a fire burning in the bake oven. He also described being illuminated by a flashlight from the direction of the farm. The account was not tested under modern conditions, and the identity of the person with the light was never established. Yet it placed a human presence at Hinterkaifeck after the likely time of death. Later investigators and writers said the cattle had been fed and perhaps milked. The exact extent of that care remains disputed. Animals may have had access to feed, and some tasks could have been done before the murders. Inside the house, bread soup had been eaten or left in the kitchen. Potato peelings were present. Smoked meat in the loft had been freshly cut, and smoke or fire was observed. The familiar claim that the killer lived at Hinterkaifeck for 4 full days goes beyond what these traces can prove. An immediate, panicked escape is harder to reconcile with them. A local offender might have waited for darkness before returning home by an unwatched route. Someone searching for money or documents would also have needed time. A stranger could have treated the empty farm as a refuge. What happened after the killings points more strongly to continued presence than to any single reason for it. On the morning of April 4, Albert Hofner arrived to repair the farm's 4-horsepower engine. He found no one waiting for him. According to his later statement, the garden gate was locked, doors he tried were closed, and he heard the dog and cattle inside. He worked for about 4.5 hours. The steady hammering and mechanical noise would have announced him to anyone on the property. When the engine finally started, the sound carried across the yard. Still no one appeared. Hofner then noticed changes. A barn door seemed to be standing open, and the dog was outside, tied near the house. He did not enter far enough to discover the bodies. Instead, he went away and reported that the repair was finished, and that no member of the family had been present. By the time others reached the property later that day, descriptions of the dog and doors were no longer perfectly consistent. The dog was found back near the stable, and at least one door was closed. Those inconsistencies weaken Hofner's account without erasing it. The changes may have been real, or separate moments may have fused together in memory. A narrow possibility remains. The offender may have watched him work. Concern finally became action late that afternoon. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer and local community leader, went to Hinterkaifeck with Michael Pohl and Jakob Sigel. They entered the barn and found the 4 bodies beneath hay and a heavy board or section of a door. At that moment, the scene was already beginning to change. Schlittenbauer moved Andreas and young Cilli, later explaining that he was looking for Josef and hoped the child might still be alive. Pohl and Sigel were alarmed by what they saw and did not follow him through every part of the building. Schlittenbauer continued through the stable into the living quarters. He opened the front door from the inside, reportedly using a key that was in or near the lock. That detail would become one of the case's most persistent points of suspicion, because a house key had been missing before the murders. Schlittenbauer then found Maria in her room and Josef in the bedroom. By the time the authorities arrived, one of the most important crime scenes in German history had already been entered, walked through, and partially rearranged. Word spread quickly. Neighbors, officials, and curious onlookers came to the farm. The site was not sealed as a modern scene would be. People moved through rooms and around the barn. Bodies had been shifted before photographs were taken, and investigators later attempted to reconstruct their earlier positions. Objects were handled. Footwear crossed surfaces that might have preserved tracks. Whatever impressions, hairs, fingerprints, or small traces the offender left were soon mixed with those of people who had every legitimate reason to be there, and others who did not. Detectives from Munich arrived after midnight and waited for daylight before conducting a fuller examination. Working through a poorly lit building with a complicated layout was difficult, but the delay cost more time. Officers later questioned large numbers of people, checked military records, pursued confessions and rumors, offered a substantial reward, and returned repeatedly to the scene. The decisive hours, however, had already passed under conditions no later effort could repair. Inside the barn, the 4 victims had been covered with hay. A roughly sawn wooden panel or door section lay over part of the group. In the house, the coverings over Maria and Josef echoed the same impulse without explaining it. There were drops of blood in the kitchen, yet no clear trail of bloody footprints led through the rooms. The offender may have cleaned footwear, changed shoes, used straw, or simply avoided stepping in pooled blood. By then, much of the floor had already been disturbed before a systematic search began. Investigators looked for robbery. A wallet was empty, and the family was known to keep cash. But money and valuables were later found in the house, including a cash box that had not been emptied. That did not eliminate theft. A burglar might have been interrupted, might have found only part of what was available, or might have been searching for a particular sum. Still, the money left behind weakened the simplest version. That theory required a stranger to kill 6 people for cash, remain long enough to tend the farm, and still overlook valuables. Up in the loft, investigators found the most suggestive evidence. Smoked meat had been cut. Hay appeared flattened in 2 places, as though 1 or more people had lain there. Hay had also been spread toward the chimney or over portions of the floor, possibly to soften footsteps. Roof tiles had been displaced in a way that could provide a view of the courtyard. A rope hung from a beam. Taken together, the details looked like signs that someone had used the loft. The difficulty was timing. Hay is flattened during ordinary farm work, people rest there, and roof tiles shift. Investigators could not show when any of those conditions began. 2 flattened areas led some investigators to suspect 2 offenders. The speed with which 4 people were apparently brought into the barn also seemed easier to explain if more than 1 person was involved. Yet a single attacker with the advantage of surprise should have killed the advantage of surprise could have killed the victims in sequence, especially if the first blows were immediately disabling. Acoustic tests and later observations suggested that sounds from the barn might not have carried clearly into the living rooms. Both readings survived, and neither could be proved. The most important physical object was missing. Investigators believed a heavy farm implement had caused the distinctive wounds, but they did not find it during the initial search. Almost a year later, in February or March 1923, the abandoned farm was being demolished. Beneath floorboards in the loft, workers discovered a Reuthaue that had belonged to Hinterkaifeck. Human blood and hair were reportedly present alongside animal material. The shape of the tool, including a projecting screw, corresponded closely with injuries described during the autopsies. The tool had been hidden inside the property, above rooms searched by police, and below the very loft that had fueled the intruder theory. Its hiding place suggested that the offender had not simply discarded it and fled. He may not have arrived armed at all. He could have selected a familiar tool from the farm, used it, carried it upstairs, and concealed it under a board. An outsider could have done that after exploring the building. Familiarity would have made each step easier. The weapon narrowed the place from which the violence came, but not the person. Another pick-like tool found near a feeding trough had reddish-brown marks and was initially examined. Testing did not establish that the marks were blood, and it was excluded as the main weapon. During demolition, a rusty knife and a metal strip said to bear stains also attracted attention. Their significance remained uncertain. Several objects looked suspicious before testing or context stripped away their value. Most led nowhere. The Reuthaue was different because it fit the wounds strongly. The autopsies were conducted at the farm on a makeshift table in the courtyard. The victims' heads were removed so specialists could compare the injuries with a possible weapon and continue the examination. In that period, the procedure was not without precedent. It later created both rumor and permanent loss. The bodies were buried without the heads, and the skulls disappeared, apparently during the disruption and destruction of the Second World War. No complete original autopsy report survives. Injury descriptions remain in other documents, summaries, and later references, but not in one intact medical file. Police also took the skulls to a clairvoyant or spiritist in the hope of generating a lead. They had 6 victims, hundreds of statements, and no suspect they could place at the weapon. As the weeks passed, the physical evidence became less useful, and rumor filled the space it left behind. No usable fingerprint identification emerged from the house or weapon. Fingerprinting was known and used in Germany by 1922, but the scene did not yield a clean, preserved print. There was no DNA science and no blood typing capable of separating every trace. Investigators had no surveillance cameras, telephone location records, or reliable way to date the impressions in the hay. Police work was becoming more systematic, but no laboratory method could recover what the crowded and altered scene had already lost. Family history immediately shaped the suspect pool. Andreas Gruber had been convicted in 1915 of an incestuous relationship with his daughter Viktoria. He received a prison sentence, and Viktoria also received a shorter sentence. The record reflects both a criminal conviction and a deeply abusive family environment. A later proceeding in 1920 ended without another conviction after testimony shifted. The conviction affected Viktoria's relationships, Josef's disputed paternity, financial obligations, and the hostility surrounding the household. It widened the motive field without identifying a killer. Viktoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, had died while serving in the First World War in December 1914, only weeks after their marriage. After his death, Viktoria became involved with Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a widowed neighbor. The two at one point discussed marriage. Andreas opposed the match. When Josef was born in 1919, paternity became contested. Schlittenbauer acknowledged the child under circumstances that later became a subject of argument, while Andreas was also widely suspected of being Josef's biological father. Money, reputation, and the possibility of marriage were tangled together long before the murders. For investigators, Lorenz Schlittenbauer was impossible to ignore. He lived close enough to know the farm's routines. He knew the family and the building. He had an intimate history with Viktoria and a personal connection to Josef. He participated in the discovery, moved bodies, entered the house ahead of the other men, and appeared able to open a door using the missing key. If the killer was a local person who could approach without alarming the dog or household, Schlittenbauer fit the general shape. Later retellings made his behavior at the discovery scene look even more troubling. Pohl and Sigel said, Schlittenbauer behaved with unusual confidence inside the property. He explained that he was searching for the child he believed might be his son. Accounts differ over exactly where the key was and how he used it. Some witnesses later recalled comments that sounded like knowledge only the offender should possess. During a visit to the ruins in 1925, he was said to have remarked on an unsuccessful attempt to bury the bodies because the ground was frozen. If accurately remembered, the statement was ominous. It was not a confession, and its wording was never supported by a contemporaneous recording. Police questioned him repeatedly. They examined his movements, relationships, disputes, and statements. They did not obtain a physical link to the weapon. No eyewitness placed him at the farm during the murders, and no contradiction was strong enough to support a charge. He had a household of his own nearby. Moving between farms without being seen was possible, but possibility was not proof. His contact with the scene contaminated the very evidence that might have incriminated or cleared him. Any trace of his presence could be explained by the discovery. Some of his behavior also allowed innocent explanations. A father searching for a missing child might move bodies. A man familiar with the house would know how to pass through it. And a community leader might take control while others froze. Schlittenbauer spent years under suspicion and successfully brought civil actions against people who publicly accused him. He died in 1941 without being charged. Motive and opportunity remained plausible, but no evidence identified him as the attacker. The hidden Reuthaue could not narrow the field to Schlittenbauer. A local farmer would know how to use such a tool and where it might be concealed, but so would many adult men in the region. The dog was just as uncertain. Some reports imply that it reacted fiercely to strangers, favoring a familiar offender. Other accounts say the animal had been injured and moved. With the accounts in conflict, its behavior could not identify either a familiar or an unfamiliar attacker. The inquiry soon widened beyond Schlittenbauer. Hinterkaifeck sat in a region where itinerant laborers, former soldiers, petty thieves and farm workers moved between communities. Investigators considered burglary gangs and men who had worked at or visited the property. A former employee could know the rooms, the family's habits, the location of cash, the dog, and the tool. That profile explained the scene without requiring an unknown intruder to live undetected above the family. Crescence Rieger, the former maid, later named several local men she distrusted, including Anton and Karl Bickler and Georg Ziegel. Her statements changed over time and were influenced by personal conflict. She said one of the men knew the farm well and that the dog did not react to him as it might to a stranger. Ziegel had worked at Hinterkaifeck and knew about the Reuthaue. Accusations also circulated that he had stolen from the family, which he denied. Familiarity made these men plausible. The lack of a reliable timeline, physical evidence, or consistent witness account kept them from becoming more than candidates. Alleged conversations about robbing Andreas brought other men into the inquiry. One witness claimed that a laborer named Peter Weber had spoken of going to the farm for money and suggested that the old man might need to be killed. The remark may have described a genuine plan, or it may have been boasting, misunderstanding, or an attempt to redirect suspicion. Police checked names, residences, and movements, but no group of burglars was tied to the scene. The cash left in the house remained a problem for a purely financial motive. Years passed, and the case absorbed new accusations. In 1951, a woman reportedly made a deathbed statement implicating her brothers, Adolf and Anton Gump. Adolf had been associated with violent paramilitary activity after the First World War and had already attracted police interest in 1922. Authorities had wanted to know where he was at the time of the murders. Anton was detained decades later as the allegation was investigated. The proceeding ended in 1954 for lack of proof. The accusation against the Gump brothers seemed to answer several questions at once. Two men could explain the paired impressions in the loft and the speed of the attack. The statement also came from inside their family, but it arrived nearly 30 years after the crime and had no supporting trace from Hinterkaifeck. Adolf was dead by then. Anton was released. Nothing placed either brother at the farm on March 31, 1922. Some leads were weaker from the beginning. Josef Bertel, an escaped psychiatric patient, became a suspect partly because he was missing, and partly because a clairvoyant claimed to recognize him from a photograph. Police circulated his name and tried to locate him. No credible evidence connected him to the farm. The suspicion rested on Bertel's absence and a clairvoyant's claim, not on a timeline or physical link. The most dramatic suspect was a dead man. Rumors claimed that Karl Gabriel, Viktoria's husband, had survived the war returned secretly, discovered that his wife had a child, and taken revenge. Over the years, stories placed him in foreign captivity, in the Soviet Union, or living under another identity. The theory had the shape of a tragedy and the convenience of explaining why no local suspect could be proved. Police did not simply accept the official notice of Karl's death. They contacted military and war graves authorities. His burial near Neuville-Saint-Vaast was confirmed, and comrades had witnessed his death in December 1914. Wartime records can contain errors, but this was more than a name on a missing person list. The return of the husband theory survives because it is memorable, not because the evidence is strong. It is one of the few popular explanations that the file pushes firmly toward folklore. Several men confessed over the years. Some may have wanted attention, absolution, money, or a strange sense of importance. Police tested each account against the barn, the weapon, the coverings, and the timeline. None held up. Public discussion had already spread many facts, making supposed private knowledge difficult to separate from rumor. The longer the case remained open, the easier it became for a false confessor to sound informed. Newspapers helped turn Hinterkaifeck into a national mystery. The image of footprints leading to a farm and never returning was irresistible. So was the idea of an unseen person above the family, eating their food and listening through the ceiling. Those details brought attention and tips. They also hardened uncertain reports into a single narrative. By the time later witnesses were interviewed again, they had lived for years inside a story the public already thought it knew. That contamination was not limited to memory. The physical farm itself became an attraction. People visited, looked through rooms, and later watched as the buildings were torn down. The hidden weapon emerged only during demolition, when its original position could no longer be documented with the precision a court would demand. The house that might have explained movement, sight lines, and sound disappeared. Investigators could measure plans and question witnesses, but they could no longer recreate every route through the connected buildings. Years later, the original distinction was almost impossible to test. A stranger would have needed to learn the layout, manage the animals, find food, and hide the weapon. A local person would have needed only to avoid notice and return home, without creating an obvious absence. The scene no longer held the traces that could separate them. The missing key sits at the center of that uncertainty. If an intruder stole it before March 31, the broken lock, footprints, newspaper, and attic noises may all belong to one period of surveillance. The killer could enter without force, wait, and move freely after the murders. If a family acquaintance already had access, the missing key might be unrelated, or may never truly have been lost. And if the key found during the discovery was simply an ordinary household key left where it belonged, later suspicion may have given it a significance it did not deserve. The footprint story offered no cleaner answer. A track toward the farm without a visible return route sounds like proof that someone remained there. Snow does not record a complete journey. The person could have left over another surface, followed an existing path, stepped into earlier prints, or belonged to the household. No officer saw the trail, and no measurement established shoe size or direction. It survived as a report, not as a track that could be tested. Nor did the noises above the living rooms settle anything. Andreas may have heard footsteps, and the former maid may have heard sounds months earlier. Animals, settling timber, wind, and work inside connected buildings could all create movement overhead. Yet, the loft contained flattened hay, a possible observation point, and the hidden murder weapon. Some may have hidden there. No evidence identified that person, or proved that anyone had lived above the family. Whatever the motive, the offender managed the farm's timetable. Maria was attacked before she could establish a routine or become expected elsewhere. The killings came at the beginning of a weekend, reducing immediate contact through school, church, and business. The bodies were moved out of direct sight. The animals were kept from drawing urgent attention, at least for a while. Doors were managed, and the weapon was hidden inside the property rather than abandoned on an open road. The control visible after the murders does not show that 6 deaths were planned from the outset. The offender may have come to confront Andreas, steal money, or settle a personal dispute, then killed the others as witnesses. Maria's arrival may have been unknown. Her outdoor clothing suggests that she had barely begun settling in. A plan made before she arrived would suddenly have included an unexpected 6th person. One formed afterward would have allowed very little time for preparation. The deaths of the children resist every narrow motive. Money did not require Josef's death, and a grievance against Andreas did not require an attack on Cilli. Killing every possible witness is one explanation, but a 2-year-old could scarcely describe what happened. Panic, rage, or a determination to erase the household all remain possible. No surviving statement selects among them. Without knowing who entered the barn first, the weight of each theory shifts. If Andreas was first, the offender removed the strongest adult before drawing the others into the barn. If Viktoria was first, a personal motive becomes easier to imagine. If Cilli entered because she heard something, the sequence may have become chaotic rather than planned. The medical evidence could not establish a complete order, and the moved bodies erased some positional clues. The scene never preserved the fact that could distinguish among those sequences. Investigators returned to witnesses over the following years. Statements became longer, not always clearer. Neighbors remembered arguments, debts, odd comments, lights, strangers, and behavior at the funeral. Some recollections may have been truthful. Others may have been shaped by dislike or the need to make sense of an event that had destroyed the normal trust of the community. In a village, a suspect was not an abstract name. He was a person seen at church, in fields, at markets, and sometimes in the search party itself. A reward eventually set at 100,000 marks generated tips during a period of severe inflation and social instability. Germany in 1922 was carrying the damage of war, political violence, shortages, and economic uncertainty. Former soldiers returned to communities transformed by loss. Local police worked with limited transport and communication. Those conditions widened the pool of plausible offenders while weakening the ability to track them. A transient man could disappear. A respected local man could remain in plain sight. Hinterkaifeck was officially closed as an active investigation in 1955, though inquiries and reviews did not stop. By then, key suspects and witnesses were dead. The farm was gone. The skulls were gone. The weapon had passed through decades of uncertain storage history. Original documents survived unevenly. Every later investigator inherited conclusions built on statements that could no longer be tested against the scene. In 2007, a group of 15 police academy students in Fürstenfeldbruck conducted a modern review of the case. Their report ran to about 188 pages. They reconstructed the evidence, studied suspects, and criticized the early preservation of the scene. Members of the group reportedly converged on one person they considered the most likely offender. The name was withheld publicly out of concern for surviving relatives and because suspicion was not proof. For a time, the project was described as the closest Hinterkaifeck had come to an answer. Even that near answer later fractured. The leader associated with the review reportedly came to doubt the favored conclusion and believed the principal suspect may have been innocent. The reversal left the review where the original investigation had ended, with organized suspicion but no physical link. A clearer reconstruction could not replace a missing fingerprint, a preserved blood sample, or a witness who could still be challenged. Modern DNA testing cannot begin without a trace that can be shown to come from the offender. No such reliably preserved sample is known in the Hinterkaifeck evidence. The victim's remains might answer some family questions, especially Josef's paternity. If exhumation were possible and justified, that result could alter the background of the case. It would not identify the person who held the Reuthaue. A paternity result would alter motive theories, not solve them. If Andreas were Josef's father, it would confirm a widely suspected and deeply disturbing family reality, but it would not prove that a neighbor killed the household. If Schlittenbauer were the father, it would strengthen one part of his connection and weaken another possible grievance. Either result would revise the family history while leaving the weapon unconnected to any suspect. The surviving Bavarian records preserved the disturbances before the murders and the bodies found in two parts of the building. They also preserved the delayed discovery, the hidden farm tool, the disputed key, and signs of activity after death. The same records show how descriptions of the dog, attic, key, and post-murder activity changed as statements were repeated. Later versions often sound more definite than their source material. Those shifting descriptions leave the largest questions open. The file does not prove that anyone lived in the attic before the murders or occupied the farm continuously through April 4. It does not establish whether one or two offenders took part, or that the missing key reached Lorenz Schlittenbauer through murder. None of those possibilities identifies the attacker. What remains fixed is the sequence the scene could still show. Someone attacked the Gruber Gabriel family and their newly arrived maid on the evening of March 31, 1922. 4 victims were brought or drawn into the barn and struck with a tool from the property. 2 were killed inside the house. The bodies were covered and the weapon was concealed in the loft. Activity continued at the farm after the likely time of death, whether by the offender, an accomplice, or someone who returned. Whoever did it knew enough to move without immediate discovery. That knowledge may have come from personal familiarity or from watching the family long enough to imitate it. The early investigation lost the chance to distinguish between the two. When the Reuthaue was finally found, the footprints were gone, the hay disturbed, the doors handled, the witnesses exposed to rumor, and the farm itself coming down. Albert Hofner spent 4.5 hours at Hinterkaifeck while the farm stood silent around him. He repaired an engine, made noise, and waited for a family that could no longer answer. Somewhere close by were the covered bodies. Above them, under a floorboard, the weapon would remain hidden for almost another year. And around Hofner, doors and a dog seemed to change position while no living resident came into view. Hofner may have joined separate moments in memory after learning what lay nearby. A neighbor could have moved the dog without understanding what had happened. The harder possibility is that the person who killed 6 people stood inside that connected house and barn. The killer may have listened to the mechanic work and waited for the yard to become quiet again. The record preserves a missing key, tracks that seem to lead inward, a loft that may have held a watcher, and the murder weapon hidden beneath its boards. 6 people were dead. Whoever moved through their home left no name behind.